St. John's Cemetery and Reformatory, a place of rumour, mystery and intrigue, a place of rest, dubbed the nursery of Catholicism in South Australia, was one of the largest Catholic communities outside Adelaide. This area was established in 1849. Let's go through the gate and meet some of the residents, and learn a little about Catholic Kapunda's past. One of the first graves you will encounter when you walk in the gates is that of Vera Peterson. Vera gained some notoriety through no fault of her own, when a book by Valerie Launton entitled True Barossa Ghost Stories was released. The book told a story of a girl from the old Reformatory who was supposedly haunting the cemetery, and named the spirit as Vera. Looking at Vera's headstone, we can tell by the dates that she was not alive in the era of the Reformatory, and therefore cannot be associated with the so-called Reformatory ghost girl. Vera's parents owned the Kapunda Coffee Palace, which was once the Lord Palmerston Hotel, that stood on the corner of Lucas and Main Street where now the newsagent stands. Vera died from peritonitis at the age of 22 in 1932. In 1861, St. John's Cemetery opened, replacing the St. John's graveyard on the hill near the Reformatory. In the same year, St. Rose's Church opened in Kapunda. The first person to be buried in the newly opened cemetery was Michael Dermody in February of that year. Along the fence line that leads to Michael Dermody's grave from the front gates lies a monument to a number of infants who have been buried in unmarked graves along the fence line. Christmas 1880 saw bushfires wreak havoc across South Australia. One such bushfire took the lives of a mother and 5 daughters in the farming community of Carpo, near Franklin Harbour on South Australia's Eyre Peninsula. Martin McCarthy and his 4 eldest boys were out reaping in the fields of their farm. His wife Mary, his 5 daughters, Mary, Honora, Catherine, Ellen and Bridget, as well as youngest son Joe, were all at the farmhouse attending to their chores. Martin noticed thick smoke in the distance, miles back towards his home. It wasn't long until he saw flames reaching into the sky. A bushfire had broken out and was moving towards him at incredible speed. Martin rallied his sons and they started making their way towards their homestead, but the fire was so ferocious and moved so fast that the men didn't get far and sought refuge in a ploughed field. At the homestead, Mary and the children had little time to escape. The girls huddled in the kitchen of the house while their mother and brother worked frantically to fill buckets from the well and fight the small spot fires that threatened to consume their home. The fire moved swiftly. Eventually Martin and the boys started making their way back towards their home. Their 40 acres of wheat had been razed to the ground, their wagons were ash, all their animals consumed by the fires. The men made their way towards the still smouldering house, calling out for their loved ones. Martin kicked what he thought was a burnt tree stump. The boys looked on in horror as their father fell to his knees and let out a scream of grief. He had kicked the badly burnt body of his wife Mary, who had huddled over their son Joe. Both had been consumed by the fire as they ran back to the house from the well. While one of the young men comforted the father, the others went to find their sisters. The boys came across the grisly sight of their sisters, all huddled together in the corner of the kitchen, dead, consumed by the fire. The McCarthy family was devastated. 7 members of their family dead, their farm, machinery, livestock all destroyed. Martin, a man now broken, decided that he would return to the place he felt was most like home, St. John's, and decided his family should all be buried near the church they used to attend. The local Franklin Harbour community sent notice of the tragedy nationwide, and made mention of Martin's intention to bury his children at St. John's. The townsfolk of Franklin Harbour, Wallaroo and Kapunda all did their best to help the remaining members of the family achieve their wish. Coffins were donated. A boat was found that could carry the burnt bodies across the Spencer Gulf together. A train carriage was booked from Wallaroo to Kapunda via Roseworthy. 2 days later, the McCarthy family and the townsfolk of Kapunda made their way from the train station to St. Rose's Church with the casket of Mrs. McCarthy and 6 children. When the funeral party arrived at the church, sadly Father Marr wouldn't allow the cheap coffins, now leaking with the blood and body fluids of the dead children, to soil his church and turn them away. Wagons were sought and the family made their way to St. John's Cemetery to be buried together. Martin McCarthy was a broken man. The Kapunda community rallied and started a subscription to help him financially. Over £1,000 were raised with donations coming from all over the country. With the money and the moral support of the St. John's and Kapunda communities, Martin was able to start to rebuild his life again as best he could. Martin McCarthy died aged 74 in 1908 and was put to rest alongside his wife and children. Father Fallon was ordained in 1849 and appointed to Kapunda in the same year. He first resided in a small log hut until the presbytery was completed in 1850. Father Fallon performed the ceremonial rites for over 176 weddings and 755 baptisms, including the burial rites of Anne Farrant, the first person buried in the original St. John's graveyard on the hill. Father Fallon served Kapunda for 10 years until on March 25, 1860 he died suddenly. Father Fallon was originally buried in the church graveyard. Later his remains were moved to the lower cemetery. A new headstone was placed on Father Fallon's grave in 1936 as a march of respect by Archbishop Killian. Next to Father Fallon lays Father Jeremiah Moynihan, who died from complications of tuberculosis. Not much is known about Father Moynihan other than he being assistant to Father Byrne at St. John's. The Reverend Michael Ryan B.G., said to be a pious and zealous member of the Catholic Church, a man of modest and unassuming manners. Father Ryan first arrived in Australia with Bishop Murphy in the year 1844, and was the first Roman Catholic priest to hold office in Kapunda. He held the positions of Vicar General and Apostolic Administrator in his time. He was one of, if not the first Catholic priest to step foot in South Australia. He is very much the reason the Catholic Church was able to prosper and survive in this state. Father Ryan was appointed with the task of building a Catholic church in Kapunda, as it was seen the town was beginning to grow rapidly with the inclusion of Anglican, Lutheran and Baptist churches. It was decided the Catholics should be represented in Kapunda as well. Father Ryan needed a suitable place to hold Mass for those who couldn't find their way to St. John's. At the time he was holding Mass in a blacksmith's premises in the town somewhere around where Kapunda Institute now stands. Eventually he chose the site for St. Rose of Lima Church to be built, of which the original church has since been destroyed and a new one built in its place. Father Ryan died of apoplexy on 24th of August 1865. There is not a lot of information available about the infamous Father Martin. What is known about Father Martin can be found in letters from various church members, priests and his death certificate. Father Martin began his life in Tipperary, Ireland in approximately 1857. Around 1889 he came to Australia by sea to Port Augusta, South Australia. At some point between 1890 and 1897 he moved to the Kapunda parish and began sermons in surrounding towns, including the St. John's Reformatory. He eventually moved into the Reformatory and became an on-site chaplain instructing the girls in religion. When the Reformatory eventually closed, Reverend Martin stayed on at the Reformatory, being visited and cared for by ex-Reformatory girls and locals, until his death from malnutrition and dehydration almost 10 years later. Ruby Olive Bland is probably the most famous of all the people buried in the cemetery, in some part thanks to the 2002 documentary hosted by Warwick Moss, which talked about ghost scandals and a cover-up by a community in church. The legacy of this documentary can be witnessed in many forums on the internet. The amount of misinformation about Miss Bland is truly astounding. Although it is not public why Miss Bland was first placed under state care, we do know that she was born near Lake Victoria in New South Wales and had a sister who lived not far from there at Renmark in South Australia. Miss Bland had been suffering from catholiosis for 5 years and was sent to Kapunda Hospital for an operation to relieve her symptoms. Unfortunately, she died on the operating table. Her family was present and subsequently signed her death certificate. Ruby was interred in the cemetery the next day, which was very common in that era. It is merely coincidence that this was the same week the Reformatory was due to close, which had been recommended in a letter from the State Children's Council almost 6 months previously. Another of the myths surrounding Ruby Bland's burial also stems from the 2002 documentary that states Ruby is not buried where curator Peter Swann claims she is. Again, the researchers of the documentary did not check facts. Peter has given us a photo of Ruby Bland's grave from circa 1914, which shows only 2 graves in the background. The grave of John Kitschke is clearly not visible in the photo, as he had yet to be interred in the cemetery. In 2002, Archbishop Wilson blessed this sign erected in the cemetery that shows a photo of the church and the buildings and the layout design of the location. The Church of St. John the Evangelist had its cornerstone laid in 1850, but the church wasn't completed until 1854. The presbytery was built at the same time and a graveyard also established. The church served the community until St. Rose's Church was established in Kapunda in 1862. In this era, a local post office and general store was also established across the road from the church to cater for the growing population living in mud brick and canvas houses in the area. In 1869, the church was converted into a school and convent under the guidance of St. Mary MacKillop and the Sisters of St. Joseph. The school had a high fence which surrounded it, to stop the girls from escaping, but to no avail, as escapes were not uncommon, with some girls making it as far as Gawler, about 20 miles away. The complex also featured cells for holding the worst of the girls for punishments. Reports from the Children's Council make note of the buildings and grounds being in excellent condition and the girls well looked after. The girls' reformatory was closed in 1909 by Archbishop O'Reilly. The remaining girls were transferred to Borough. The buildings were then used as private dwellings until the 1950s. The church was demolished in 2002 after constant vandalism. Now the reformatory ruins are rubble on a hill, with the only things left standing from the era a palm tree and a pine tree. One can still work out where each building sat. The former St. John's graveyard is also visible, with at least 2 graves still being surrounded by iron fences. The first person buried in this cemetery was Anne Farrant. 11 people were removed from the graveyard and buried in the lower cemetery in 1891. Today the cemetery stands as a focal point for historians and genealogists. It is still a currently used cemetery and therefore should be treated with much respect.